Of all the states in the world to possibly go to war over water, there is none whose history puts more stress upon the importance of water than Egypt and the Nile River. Now, my friends, thanks to the construction of a dam by Ethiopia further up the Nile for its own development, this massive dependence upon a single water source between the two has turned into an issue that is very quickly turning into a geopolitical battleground. One that the world is looking down on and wondering if full-blown war could actually be the end result of this. And look, when I say this, I'm not talking about this in idle speculation. I'm not talking about this through any sense of fear-mongering or anything else. The actions and words of the two states and their leaders demonstrate what it is that I am talking about. As an example, in the beginning of September, Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdel Ati would reveal that he had written to the UN Security Council to protest what he called Ethiopia's unilateral policies of continuing building and filling the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD. We'll probably call this like GERD over the course of this or something, or GERD. GERD? Let me know in the comments what it is that you prefer. This being something which Egypt sees as limiting and depriving it of its rightful share of water. But my friends, just filling it is not the only issue. Egypt has been angered over how Ethiopia has moved forward with completing the construction of the dam and filling its reservoir without consulting downstream Egypt first. According to the letter submitted to the UN, the GERD is something that threatens regional stability. And so, okay, for a lot of you that are watching this right now, you may wonder, how does a simple dam threaten stability? And that is something that we will certainly explain. The letter itself does not actually add anything new to the long-standing dispute over the GERD. However, it does take on added significance because it comes amidst rising tension between the two nations and a number of arms deals that are going down right now. Yes, you see, Egypt has vowed to act in, quote, in defense of its people's interests, after Ethiopia announced the completion of the 5th stage of filling the GERD. The letter presented by Egypt's foreign minister on September 1st, 2024, to the UN Security Council would say, and I quote, after having exhausted all amicable means, including through repeatedly resorting to the Security Council in hopes of persuading Ethiopia to desist in its unlawful unilateral policies and accept any of the existing compromise solutions that balance the interests and rights of all parties, the government of Egypt, therefore, stands ready to exercise its right to defend and protect the rights and interests of the Egyptian people per the UN Charter. As for what form defense of one's people's interests would take, that has not exactly been determined yet, but moves are being made. Egypt recently deployed commandos and heavy military equipment in Somalia, which shares a very long border with Ethiopia, and has oftentimes been a source of, well, trouble in the past. When they did this, they did not necessarily specify its possible reason or desired action, but its leaders have previously warned of a military response. Egypt has outright threatened to blow up the dam. As for why anything like this was even allowed, President Mohammed of Somalia would secure Egypt's military support after Ethiopia would sign an agreement with the secessionist Somaliland region in Somalia to have access to the Red Sea. That is one of the key pain points of all this. This is something whose full story we did kind of cover on this channel in the past when we were talking about a possible war that could break out, and it does have a fascinating story of a failed state. So definitely check out that video I did on Somalia. But anyway, the deal signed by Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Somaliland's leader, Muse Bihi Abdi, in December of 2023, would see Somaliland lease 20 kilometers of the Red Sea to Ethiopia in order to establish a military base there. In response to Egypt's deployment of military forces in Mogadishu, Ethiopia would warn that it could not, quote, stand idle while other actors are taking measures to destabilize the region, adding that Addis Ababa was, quote, again, vigilantly monitoring developments in the region that could threaten its national security. Everyone is feeling very tense right now, and the unfolding security tensions in the Horn of Africa could very well spark a new war in a region that for decades has been struggling to recover from varying different conflicts. Conflicts that, as I said before, if you've watched here on this channel, you may be all too familiar with it. If you're not, definitely check those out. This brings up the question then of why exactly all this is happening, you may wonder. Why is this such a big deal to both sides? Just how important is one waterway that countries would be willing to go to war in the modern day and age over it? Well, let me break it down for a moment by country so you understand. Between the two sides, Egypt has a population of around 116 million people, and is a country that heavily relies upon the Nile River for nearly all. We're talking like 95% of its fresh water. Whether this be for standard household use, for industry, or for agriculture, and especially on that note for growing cotton, which is one of Egypt's primary industries. Water scarcity is a really big issue in Egypt, which, as I'm sure people are already aware, is a predominantly desert country, something with very limited renewable water resources. The country's population over the decades has been steadily increasing, which that means that those limited water resources come under further and further strain. The situation is in addition made worse by climate change and weather, which is causing more frequent droughts and reducing the amount of rainfall in the region, putting further strains upon the already limited water sources. According to the World Bank as well as waterproject.org, Egypt has an annual water supply of 60 billion cubic meters, which is less than the amount that is required to meet the needs of its population of over 100 million people. It simply does not have enough. That is not to say necessarily that there is not plenty of water, but the overuse of water resources in Egypt has led to the depletion of aquifers, and the intrusion of seawater into coastal aquifers has resulted in deterioration of water quality and an increase in water-related diseases. Things are not exactly the best there. To address the issue of water scarcity, the Egyptian government has over the years implemented a number of different measures, which include the construction of new treatment plants for water, efforts to conserve the water that they have, and the development of new water resources. However, these efforts have been hindered over the years by severe political instability, economic challenges, and limited financial resources. For context of that, if you want to know more about that situation, go and definitely check out the video that I did on how Egypt has been destroying itself. That is... It's not a good time to say the least, and that feeds entirely into what I'm talking about here for context. On the other side of the situation, though, Ethiopia says that it desperately needs this dam in order to produce electricity for the 50 to 60% of its population who currently do not have access to electricity in the first place. Not only would this help its own people at home, but simultaneously in developing more electrical power, this would allow more enterprises and business growth within Ethiopia, as it is able to further industrialize sectors of its economy that never had been before. This is something that arguably is vital for a nation that, for all intents and purposes, has been landlocked for years and is itching to get out onto the world stage. You may wonder how it is that one dam is supposed to fix all of this, and the answer is quite simply that it's pretty big. When things were first announced for construction, at full capacity, this huge hydroelectric dam was supposed to be 1.8 kilometers or 1.1 miles long and 145 meters or 476 feet high. It was expected that it would be able to generate more than 5,000 megawatts, at least that was the initial goal. To put this into perspective so you understand just how big of a deal this is, that is something that at the time would double Ethiopia's production of electricity from one dam, to which less than half of the country's population of 125 million people have access. That is a very big deal for both national development economically, as well as vital for a government to secure its people and maintain their happiness from progress. Both sides see this waterway as absolutely vital, and neither is capable of backing down. That all being said, though, water issues in this region of the world are not anything new. They have large amounts of historical precedence, and that is something that has led to some of the issues that we see today. And so in order to understand the conflict today, we will have to look at that past. Unlike in previous episodes where we focus on one particular country and go into such extensive detail about it, this is a dispute between multiple states, which means that in order to cover it, we can really only go back by 100 years or so and not analyze the deep political parts of every single one. So no, this is not another coup video. If you want a coup video, I got plenty of those. Also, my friends, I'm sorry to interject this right now, but I have to say this. My Turkey trip just launched, and I'm going to make a fancier ad. Of course, I am going to do that, but this trip is going fast. With everything that I talk about on this channel, if you want to actually have a chance to go and live some of the sites, if you want to go to some of the ancient sites of Turkey with me, flying a hot air balloon over Cappadocia, seeing the Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque, and going to so many ancient temples and sites, then my friends, you have to join us. The trip is literally a year away at this point, and when you go and book the trip, you only have to pay 25% down, and the first 8 people that sign up get a $200 discount. Past that point, you can do a payment plan, so, you have a year to be able to take care of things. But this is going to be a 9-day trip with 2 plane flights inside the country that are already included in it, so there is so much that we are going to be doing here. Anyway, enjoy the show. I'm going to be making a much fancier ad here later, but by God, time is running out. Anyway, like many stories in Africa, everything in here kind of begins with colonization. Egypt was a protected state under the control of Great Britain, and in 1929, an agreement was concluded between Egypt and Great Britain regarding the utilization of waters of the Nile River, with Britain representing its colonies in the Nile River basin. At the time that we're talking about here, Ethiopia was not a part of this, as it, at the time, was not colonized by any European power. Actually, fun fact, it is the only native African state to have that status at that time. Of course, that status would change about 6 years later when Italy would go and invade, but that's a whole other story entirely. Either way, the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty covered many issues related to the Nile River and its tributaries. And of particular relevance to the issue that we are talking about now in the current day and age is that it granted Egypt an annual water allocation of 48 billion cubic meters, and Sudan 4 billion cubic meters out of an estimated average annual yield of 84 billion cubic meters. In addition, hugely, the 1929 agreement granted Egypt veto power over any construction projects on the Nile River, or, and this is the really important part when I mention this, any of its tributaries, in an effort to minimize any interference that could come to the flow of water into the Nile. The problem when we talk about this here is that the tributaries were not all owned by Egypt, but for all intents and purposes, Egypt was basically supposed to be in control of the entire Nile, regardless of what actually the details were, per the British. So my friends, fast forward by about 30 years, and in 1959, Egypt and independent Sudan would go and sign a bilateral agreement, something which effectively reinforced the provisions that had been seen in the 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. The 1959 agreement would increase water allocations to both Egypt and Sudan, with Egypt's water allocation being raised from 48 billion cubic meters to 55.5 billion cubic meters, and Sudan's from 4 billion to 18.5 billion cubic meters. Along with that, the agreement stated that in the case of any kind of increase in average water yield, like, if there was any particular years in which there was a series of big storms or floods or anything else that increased the total amount of water, the increased yield should be shared equally between the two downstream states. So if it increased by like 6 billion, then that means that each of them were going to get an additional 3 billion. The bad part to consider here is that the 1959 agreement, like the 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, did not actually make any allowance for the water needs of any of the other states in the region, including Ethiopia. This would be a problem because the highlands of Ethiopia supply more than 80% of the water that flows into the river, which is kind of a big deal. Over the years, and especially as the populations of other countries of the Nile River Basin increased, and these countries began to develop the capacity to more effectively harvest the waters of the Nile River for national development, agriculture, and everything else, disagreements would then naturally arise about water rights and usage. Namely, in the second half of the 20th century, Egypt would insist that the water rights that it acquired through the 1929 and 1959 Nile water agreements had to be honored by other states, and that no construction project can be undertaken on the Nile River or any of its tributaries without prior approval from Cairo, which is a really big power play. In fact, various Egyptian leaders through its history would threaten to go to war to protect these rights before. Not just in the case of Ethiopia recently, states further upstream such as Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Ethiopia have all argued that they are not bound by these treaties because they were never party to them in the first place, which in turn has threatened Egypt's position. In fact, side note here, as we are talking about another country, but shortly after independence from Great Britain in 1961, Tanganyika's new leader, Julius Nyerere, would argue that the Nile Waters Agreement placed his country and other upstream states at Egypt's mercy, essentially forcing them to subject their national development plans to the approval and supervision of Cairo. This kind of approach for national development and policy would destroy the independence of his country and effectively make it a kind of water vassal state to Egypt. All the upstream states would then argue in favor of new, more inclusive legal frameworks for governing the Nile River Basin, something that Egypt does not appreciate and has fought to control for decades. Still, that all being said, we would see some developments. In 1999, the varying different states along the Nile, except Eritrea, would go and sign the Nile Basin Initiative, or NBI, this being in an effort to enhance cooperation on the use of the common Nile Basin water resources. Under the new NBI, the states began to work on trying to develop a permanent legal framework that would allow them to govern the Nile River Basin. Eventually, this would end up being called the Cooperative Framework Agreement, or CFA, and as part of the agreement, the countries would focus on equitable water allocation when discussing Nile governance, along with water security. When I'm describing the situation, of course, I'm using a lot of legal jargon because we are talking about treaties at this point, and the countries seem to, from that language, be finally ready to work together. But no. By May of 2010, the CFA was ready for signature, with the countries of Ethiopia, Burundi, Rwanda, Kenya, and Tanzania, and Uganda already having signed it. Egypt and Sudan, though, well, they had a little bit of an issue with the whole thing, arguing that their acquired rights to the water of the Nile River would not be protected. Egypt and Sudan immediately gave their intention to not sign the agreement because they objected to specific wording of one of the parts of the treaty, Article 14b, which I actually have right here. It says, and I quote, "Nile Basin states therefore agree, in a spirit of cooperation, not to significantly affect the water security of any other Nile Basin state." They really didn't like the way that this was phrased. And so, these two states went and proposed an alternative wording for Article 14b, with it stating, "Nile Basin states therefore agree, in a spirit of cooperation, not to significantly affect the water security and current uses and rights of any other Nile Basin state." With, mind you, when I say this, great emphasis being placed upon that last part here, not to significantly affect the water security and current uses and rights of any other Nile Basin state. You may wonder what exactly the whole difference with that is. Well, this wording was rejected by the other states, naturally, who argued that the current uses and rights phrasing would cement the concept of prior rights, including those that had been created by the Nile Waters Agreements with, Britain in 1929 and 1959, and effectively retain the inequity and unfairness that has characterized the allocation and utilization of water resources of the Nile River since the 1920s. That was not going to fly, and so progress on agreements was not actually going to be able to be made. And so that, my friends, in turn brings us back to Egypt and Ethiopia. On April 2nd, 2011, then Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, would lay the foundation for the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The GERD would be placed on the Blue Nile tributary, the thing that feeds into the Nile River itself and is responsible, as I said, for the overwhelming majority of its water. Shortly after the announcement, authorities in Cairo would immediately launch a campaign of words against what they saw as an attempt by Addis Ababa to interfere with Egypt's water needs. The president of Egypt at the time, Mohamed Morsi, would angrily state that while he was not, quote, calling for war with Ethiopia, that Egypt's water security must not be violated at all, and that, quote, all options are open. Egypt would not accept any projects on the Nile River that threatened their livelihood. As a result of this campaign, it would create one of the first big problems that Ethiopia would face with the dam: financing. Because, my friends, when we describe all this, what we are talking about is a mega project, especially for a country like Ethiopia at its current stage of development. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is estimated to cost close to $5 billion US, which is around 7% of what Ethiopia's GDP was in 2016. When you look at it on the personal level, this is an even more significant cost, because with the GDP per capita in Ethiopia being around $450 when the project was, first started back in 2012, that's a lot. What is even more significant is that the Ethiopians have largely been paying for the dam, well, by themselves. Yes, normally when it comes to big mega projects, these are things that are usually funded by big international corporations and banks by other countries. China has been big in this when we talk about things with the Belt and Road Initiative. The lack of international financing for projects on the Blue Nile River over the years has been something that has been persistently attributed to Egypt's campaign to keep control of the Nile itself. They do not want outside countries to involve themselves and finance these projects, and most places would rather avoid creating an international incident over a loan. So, amazingly, Ethiopia has been forced to finance the GERD with crowdsourcing efforts. For everything that they did, they might as well have posted a GoFundMe. Internal fundraising would come in the form of selling bonds from the government and even persuading employees to contribute portions of their income to the dam itself. Yeah, similar to what some people would do back during World War II in donating money to the government and war effort, the dam is seen in Ethiopia largely as a kind of war on poverty, as a sign of national pride. That's not to say that they did everything entirely on their own, because later on, the Bank of China would invest in the dam over $1 billion US, but that is something that would come up later. Either way, to ease tensions with Egypt, Ethiopia would agree to establish an international panel of experts in 2012 to provide an assessment of GERD's benefits and negative impacts, especially on Egypt and Sudan, because they were the ones that didn't want this to happen. This would be called the IPOE, which was tasked to build confidence among the three countries and was composed of 10 experts, 2 from each of the 3 countries and 4 independent international experts. For a while, progress really seemed to be made. After several consultations and studies, the IPOE would release a 59-page report in 2013, a report which would be made public a year later. And while this most certainly was a sign of progress, there was a couple complications. While the document did argue that the GERD would increase the overall management of the Blue Nile and augment resilience to the effects of climate extremes, flooding, and other things, it did also stress the need for further studies, as most of the documentation that was provided by Ethiopia appeared to be too general for any kind of real quantitative impact assessment on Egypt and Sudan. Ethiopia was simply being too vague, especially with regard to the economic cost and benefits of the dam itself. After this was done, Ethiopia and Sudan would accept the IPOE's conclusion, while Egypt would reject it, and would even contest the very legitimacy of Ethiopia's construction of the dam. Many different charges would be made during this time, such as that the dam and its design was way too big in the first place, that it was inefficient. But despite all that, Ethiopia would persist. And so, coinciding with the change of Egyptian leadership from President Mohamed Morsi to President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in 2013, Cairo would adopt a more flexible position towards the GERD. They began to actually accept it. The first sign of this change would come about in 2014 during the African Union Summit at Malabo, which is in Equatorial Guinea, where al-Sisi actually agreed with the then Ethiopian Prime Minister, Haile Mariam. Egypt would agree to resume technical negotiations and also to respect the IPOE recommendations. Following the Malabo Summit, a Tripart National Committee, or TNC, which was composed of 4 experts from Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, were then tasked with selecting international consultants to conduct the IPOE recommended additional studies. Which sounds great, but wait, hold on. Unfortunately, due to disagreements over what exactly the criteria was supposed to be for selecting the consultancy firm, the TNC ended up failing, and consequently, Egypt would ask Ethiopia to stop construction of the dam until the studies were completed, which Ethiopia would ignore. Things were going to proceed anyway. Now, normally, my friends, when it is that we talk about geopolitical issues and these kinds of things, this is where you would expect me to likely say, but wait, it gets worse. But amazingly enough, no, actually at this time. Surprisingly, in the spring of 2015, the 3 countries of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and their foreign ministers, would meet in Khartoum and reached a preliminary agreement called the Declaration of Principles, or DOP. The DOP included 10 basic principles that would express a willingness for cooperation in understanding downstream and upstream water needs. This was pretty big and seemed to be a huge step forward. The 2015 agreement would represent an important, but honestly, when we describe this, very predictable shift in how Cairo had to approach the Nile River. Basically, that the colonial agreements with the British back in 1929, almost a century earlier, that these were simply unsustainable. Egypt was not going to be allowed to just control the entire Nile. There was simply no way that they could actually do that. We already mentioned it here before, but 85% of the water that flows into the Nile River comes from the Ethiopian highlands through the Blue Nile, with the rest coming from the White Nile part. It was just horribly unrealistic for Egypt to believe that it could continue to stop Ethiopia from using water resources that were located within its borders to meet the needs of its people. Yes, it is true that Egypt relies entirely on the Nile for just about all of their water needs, but at the same time, states that were further upstream also needed to be able to develop, and in order to do that, they needed water. They would not be able to just bully other states, and especially when we talk about this Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is in a position that it could cause significant harm to the quality and quantity of the water that flows into the Nile, because again, they control about 85% of it. Still, that all being said, despite this new understanding and this sense of improvement, talks would ultimately not go anywhere after that. Now, I didn't lie to you all, it did not get worse yet, alright? That was a marked improvement, but then, of course, I guess later they kind of would, and then after that everything gets deadlocked, so it does get worse. Okay, never mind, I take my words back. Fast forward by about 3 years, and you have the National Independent Research Scientific Group, or NIRSG, in 2018. The NIRSG would be a 9-party mechanism, and was something that was created to select international consultancy groups that would conduct the IPOE studies. In their talks, the NIRSG would actually make significant progress in discussing the procedures for the first filling of the dam. However, the scientific group did not actually agree on what baseline scenarios were supposed to be for the studies in the first place, due to the fact that Egypt would insist that their current water use and levels needed to be regarded as the baseline itself. No discussion on water distribution could actually take place until people understood that the large amounts of water, the overwhelming majority of water from the Nile that Egypt already technically, I guess, had, that is how things had to remain. The 3 main parties were also unable to reach a compromise on the long-term operation and coordination mechanisms of the dam and how it would all function, electricity division, etc. Still though, talks would continue between the countries, and on November 6, 2019, the foreign ministers of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt would resume talks in Washington, D.C., under the observer of third parties, this being the United States and the World Bank. Now, these are very important right here, because it shows how the United States has been involved in these talks. In the discussions, Ethiopia would go and propose filling the reservoir with a release of 35 cubic kilometers of water per year, which would result in the complete filling of the reservoir within 5 years. Egypt would counter that this was too little water for them and demanded a larger amount of water to be released each year, asking for 40 cubic kilometers of water to be released, and for the reservoir to be filled within 7 years. The talks did not proceed forward, and in February of 2020, the USA would say in a statement, quote, "We appreciate the readiness of the government of Egypt to sign the agreement and its initialing of the agreement to evidence its commitment," adding that, quote, "consistent with the principles set out in the DOP, and in particular the principles of not causing significant harm to downstream countries, final testing and filling should not take place without an agreement." The United States was at this time making its stance known. And that is something that would actually anger a number of people in Ethiopia who came to see the USA and the World Bank as siding with Egypt despite their promised positions as neutral observers. Ethiopia would subsequently skip talks and negotiations would break down. Following the failed talks in Washington, Egypt would then call upon the United Nations Security Council to intervene over the dispute, which ultimately did nothing, and Ethiopia decided that it was going to move forward with its own and first dam filling anyway. Because of this, Egypt would be outraged, and an African Union-led round of negotiations would follow between the 3 parties. But these, just like the rest, would do nothing. It is here then at this time, my friends, that people really start to become afraid that a conflict was brewing. On the 24th of October 2020, then US President Donald Trump would state on a public phone call to Sudan's Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that, quote, "It's a very dangerous situation because Egypt is not going to be able to live that way. And I said it, I say it loud and clear, they'll blow up that dam, and they have to do something." Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed would respond that, quote, "Ethiopia will not cave into aggression of any kind," and that threats were, quote, "misguided, unproductive, and clear violations of international law." Still though, no shots would actually be fired. No missiles were launched, nothing would necessarily happen yet. Instead, things were kind of stuck in a state of limbo. The African Union discussions would end in a deadlock in 2021, with President al-Sisi of Egypt saying in April of that year, quote, "I am telling our brothers in Ethiopia, let's not reach the point where you touch a drop of Egypt's water, because all options are open." This, of course, being something that would imply war. The scenario that I'm describing here would take place again in the second half of 2021. This being when Egypt would once again bring up the issue to the United Nations Security Council, while Ethiopia would just unilaterally proceed with the second filling of the dam. A UN Security Council session would urge the 3 parties to please restart talks within the African Union's framework, but ultimately to no avail. As tensions would continue to heat up through 2022, neighbors and business partners would call on both sides to come back to the negotiation table. As an example of that, in August of 2022, the permanent mission of the United Arab Emirates to the United Nations would urge Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan to continue negotiating on the issue of the GERD in good faith under the brokerage of the African Union after Ethiopia had completed its 3rd filling at that time, saying, and I quote, "The United Arab Emirates believes that a successful conclusion of negotiations on the GRD is within reach and recognizes the great opportunity it presents to enhance and accelerate regional integration while bolstering cooperation and sustainable development in the region and beyond, in the spirit of the African solution to African challenges. Despite that belief, though, agreements would not be made. Fast forward by another year, and in September of 2023, Ethiopia would announce that it had finished a fourth filling. And this, my friends, is where things got particularly tense, because that announcement came just after the three countries resumed negotiations. This being after a lengthy break, as everything had broken down back in 2021. Ethiopia just pushed forward anyway, and the Egyptian foreign minister would condemn Ethiopia's announcement that it had filled the dam on the Nile as illegal, saying that the unilateral measure by Addis Ababa to complete the mega dam's filling would weigh on negotiations. In a statement that the Foreign Ministry of Egypt would put out, they would say that the unilateral measure by Addis Ababa to complete the megadam's filling would weigh on negotiations. Despite this, though, nothing was really done. And at this point, we are going to be skipping by a decent amount of time, my friends, but that does bring us to this year, in 2024, where many things have happened that has the world on edge, fearing that something could happen next, and all of it starts in Somalia. Now, my friends, I did a video on this before with Somalia and how it became a failed state. So if you want to know that full story, definitely go and check out that video. But to cover the developments that we are talking about now, we need to go into this a little bit and why exactly Ethiopia and Somalia are at odds with one another. Well, it all comes down to the ambitions of Ethiopia and its Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. There is a strong desire from the government as well as its people to not have Ethiopia be landlocked anymore. They want it to have a port, to have sea access. Ethiopia had lost its access to the sea back when Eritrea seceded in the early 1990s. On New Year's Day, January 1st, 2024, Abiy Ahmed would sign a controversial deal with the self-declared Republic of Somaliland, this being something to lease a 20-kilometer or 12-mile section of its coastline for 50 years to set up a naval base. Something that Somaliland has been pushing hard for years, and that is not something that Somalia wants at all. For context, Somaliland broke away from Somalia more than 30 years ago. But Somalia regards Somaliland as very much a part of their core territory. Because of this, they described the deal with this breakaway state as an act of aggression. Considering the instability of the country already, Somalia fears that this kind of move might set a precedent and encourage other countries to recognize Somaliland's independence, as well as other parts of the country that have also been trying to break free for years. Because of this increased tension, because of this issue, Egypt is now capitalizing on this. In addition to training exercises that were done in the previous year, on August 14th, 2024, Egypt would go and sign a defense pact with Somalia that would see Egypt send 5,000 troops to Somalia by the end of the year in order to participate in the new African Union-led Support and Stabilization Mission, or AWSOM. This is something that will replace the current African Union Transition Mission, or ATMIS, which is something that has been in Somalia since 2022 as, well, the entire thing is horribly unstable. What is so interesting about this is that this planned dispatch of troops to Somalia is actually Egypt's first contribution to African Union peacekeeping missions in the country. The new mission would be something that would implement peace-building measures such as institutional reforms, capacity building for Somalia's civil servants, and more. Along with these 5,000 troops, under the security agreement, Cairo also reportedly plans to dispatch an additional 5,000 troops. This is a pretty big deal. But in addition to sending troops, weaponry, and ammunition to Somalia, Egypt also plans to conduct joint military exercises with the country. The planned exercises that I'm talking about here include air, ground, and naval forces, and perhaps one can argue this is all intended as a show of force to send a warning message to Ethiopia right on its border to not mess with Egypt's water, that they will have an enemy immediately on their border. Along with these efforts, Ethiopia has effectively been kicked out of Somalia. They would announce that Ethiopian troops would not be part of the African Union force from next January. For context, this is the start of the African Union's third peace support operation. The first one was deployed back in 2007 after al-Shabaab Islamist militants went and took control of the Somali capital. Ethiopia had months prior sent over its own troops across the border to help fight against these militants and has long been a supporter of the Somali state against these varying different extremist factions. As it stands, there are at least 3,000 Ethiopian troops that are under the current African Union mission. And in August of just this past month, the Somali prime minister would say that Ethiopia had to withdraw its other 5,000 to 7,000 soldiers that were stationed in several regions under separate bilateral agreements, unless it withdrew from the port deal with Somaliland. As you can probably guess from what it is that I've described, this has caused things to get exceptionally tense, and Ethiopia is horribly offended. They see this as a kind of slap in the face for, as the foreign minister would put it, the sacrifices Ethiopian soldiers have paid for Somalia over the years. It is not only in the year 2007 that Ethiopia has been involved. Ethiopia has been a key ally of Somalia in its fight against al-Qaeda-linked militants and said that it would, quote, not stand idle while other actors take measures to destabilize the region. Somalia's defense minister would hit back, saying Ethiopia should stop wailing, as everyone will, quote, reap what they sowed. Very strong words, mind you. Which, on that note, my friends, that brings us to today. At the time that I am writing this and then subsequently recording this, which is then the next day, an Egyptian ship would deliver a significant consignment of military equipment to Somalia on Sunday, September 22nd. After this would happen, Somali Defense Minister Abdulakir Mohammed Nur would thank Egypt in a social media post. This is actually the second such delivery from Egypt in just like a month. As for what it included, according to Reuters news agency as well as port officials, it would include anti-aircraft guns, artillery, and much, much more. In his post on X, Mr. Nur would state, quote, Somalia has passed the stage where they were dictated to and awaited the affirmation of others on who it will engage with. We know our own interests, and we will choose between our allies and our enemies. Thank you, Egypt. Which, yeah, there is basically no guesswork with that whatsoever. That is a direct jab against Ethiopia. Ethiopia would in turn express its concern at the arrival of the weapons in Mogadishu, saying that it could exacerbate the security situation in Somalia. Speaking on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York, Ethiopia's Foreign Minister Taye Atske-Selassie would say that they could fall into the hands of militants. Along with Ethiopia, Somaliland, which, yes, technically speaking, this is not recognized internationally, it is the breakaway state that we've mentioned, it had a similar message on Monday saying that it was deeply alarmed by the shipment. Somaliland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs would say in a statement, quote, the unchecked proliferation of arms in an already fragile environment heightens the risk of an arms race, with various factions likely seeking to acquire their own stockpiles in order to safeguard their interests. At the same time that was happening, in a further example of the strains in the region, Egypt would call on its citizens that were living in Somaliland to leave the country, which I guess not saying country because it's not being recognized as a country, but to leave the area for security reasons. Yeah, for those of you who are watching, this last statement is something that for many listening would most certainly sound like an alarm bell going off, almost like a war is about to break out. The question really becomes, is it really? Well, reality is more complicated considering modern interconnectivity. After all, per the words of the president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the state sees its military deal with Somalia as something that is historic. It is a golden opportunity, a possible chance to settle the score over the megadam. Rather than any fighting taking place within Egypt itself, it is very possible that the battle over the Nile could very well play out in Somalia. Per Al Jazeera and other news agencies, it could potentially lead to a low-scale interstate conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt if their troops meet at the Somalia border. But, and mind you when I say this is a very big but, both Ethiopia, Egypt, and Somalia are already coping with their own internal strife. Ethiopia with low-level rebellions in several regions of its country, Somalia recovering from a destructive 30-year civil war, along with the insurgent problem that is still ongoing like with al-Shabaab, and Egypt is in the midst of its own economic crisis, with blackouts across the country and water scarcity already proving to be a problem. As I said before, for more context on that, you need to check out my full video on why Egypt is destroying itself. The point is, experts are saying that neither can afford further warfare. They cannot afford another conflict, and more unrest would inevitably lead to further problems down the line. If a conflict went and broke out, it could further complicate the geopolitics of the Red Sea by drawing in other players and further affect global trade who have no wish to see a fight break out in what is arguably one of the most valuable points on Earth. We're talking about a spot that is right next to the Suez Canal, and considering what has already been going on with the Houthis in the region along Yemen, no one wishes to see an additional conflict take place. At least 17,000 ships go through the Suez Canal each year, which means that over 10% of all global trade passes through the Red Sea. We are talking about the shipment of goods of over $1 trillion. For this reason, countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey, all of these different entities have tried to forge deals, partnerships, and other things with African nations like Somalia that border the Red Sea in order to be able to secure their own trade. As an example of this, the United Arab Emirates has heavily invested in Somaliland's Berbera port and holds significant influence over Ethiopia because of its investments there, the things that Ethiopia actively needs. Turkey, on the other hand, propositions itself as neutral, as it has ties with both Ethiopia and Somalia, and at this point, all eyes are probably going to be on the next diplomatic push that is by Turkey this month. But, my friends, at that point, we are talking about another round of talks, and considering every single thing that we have shown on here so far, the talks themselves have typically not necessarily been successful. Yes, a water war has not happened yet, but per the words of Egyptian President al-Sisi, quote, "Nothing is off the table." With that, my friends, I think that we're going to leave things here today. Whether or not a conflict breaks out, whether or not something else happens, how the talks go, etc., or what things look like a few months down the line, you can be sure that we're going to follow up and explain all of that. But with that, we're going to end things here. Thank you, my friends, for listening. I appreciate all of you. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know in the comment section below what it is that we should do next. And actually, on that note, one of the things that I'm going to do is I am going to be doing the next video that is on the Germany economic issue. That was highly requested in my community poll. So when I go and post one of these, make sure that you all vote in it so I know what it is that you all would like to see. If you like what it is that I do, considering how painful it is that YouTube can be, make sure to go ahead and subscribe to my Patreon. There is a link that is down in the description, and I do need to go ahead and stress this because we've gotten a number of messages that are quite confused. Yes, I am the History of Everything podcast, but there is a YouTube channel that is actually called The History of Everything. So on that note, if you go and look up like History of Everything on Patreon, you are going to probably see his channel, not mine. Thank you, my friends, and I will see you all here next time. Goodbye, guys.